really liked that sense of discovery, posing a scientific question, forming a hypothesis, and using these amazing characterization tools to pursue those. And you finally find that little detail, maybe it's a big detail, but that bit of understanding that puts it all together, that closes the loop. It's really exciting to both work at the frontier of a materials problem, but also work at the frontier of methodology and characterization tools and creating something for next generations of scientists.
Cliff Shull and Ernest Woolen were pioneers, curious people, and they are famous for establishing this use of neutrons for material studies. And it led to a method of materials characterization that is unique and contributing a lot to the understanding of materials that we use in our everyday life.
On December 7th, 1941, Japan, like its infamous Axis partners, struck first and declared war afterwards.
Every day they would document what was done, starting with first criticality in 1943. And so it would say things like, today the biologists put 500 fruit flies into the reactor and 50 mice, because they were trying to study radiation effects on living things. That was an important part of the Manhattan Project effort, was to understand the impact of the use of nuclear weapons. They needed to make a beam of neutrons that had a single energy in it and then be able to vary that energy in order to measure the neutron cross-sections of fissile materials, U-235 and Pu-239. And they needed that data in order to be able to figure out how much material they would need to make a bomb, a fission device.
The scientists who were working on these things, they were supposed to keep their noses to the grindstone, and give us information about the nuclear properties and cross-sections and things like that. But they're curious people, and they importune their bosses.
It was Ernie Woolen who led that effort. He made the original request to the head of the reactor to say, can I have a beam port here? I want to try neutron diffraction. I think it could be important. In the spring of '44, they started this work with some difficulty. And then in the summer and early fall, it began to work. And by December, they had some really beautiful diffraction peaks from calcite crystal.
But of course, things were secret in those days. Oak Ridge was a secret city, so the scientists couldn't talk about what they had done.
To keep the most closely guarded secret of the war, technicians and even scientists were strictly limited to knowledge of the specific tasks to which they were assigned.
Here it is, General Groves, plutonium.
And so even though this was the sort of peak of the effort for the Manhattan Project, they were very focused on trying to end the war. they made note of the fact that this had great potential for other uses, and all of the reasons why neutron diffraction ultimately became a useful technique, because neutrons interact with matter differently, are sensitive to different things, are very penetrating, have a different relationship between the energy and the wavelength, which is what makes them useful for inelastic scattering. And basically said, after the war, once we've got some time, we need to go back and study this more thoroughly.
I think the sense of history here at Oak Ridge is very interesting, and it's also very inspiring to see what our fellow countrymen built, and these days the world has helped us build. And it's humbling to be part of that process. At the same time, day to day, I'm very much focused on utilizing those tools to their full advantages and really dive into scientific discovery.
I visited the laboratory in April of 1946, and I was so delighted and so intrigued when Ernie showed me his first powder pattern. This was the first indication you had enough intensity to see powder diffraction effects.
Oak Ridge National Lab was being created post-World War II. Scholl and Woolen were working on the graphite reactor to really explore the possibilities for neutron diffraction. Together, they did some really pioneering experiments that demonstrated that diffraction was not only viable, but did give you that additional different information than you could obtain with X-rays, and did an awful lot of first-of-a-kind experiments.
I remember very well a conversation that Ernie and I had with Eugene Vigner, who was research director here at the lab at the time. Ernie and I had borrowed some of Eugene's time, and we were in his office and explaining our tale of woe here, all of these discrepancies. And Eugene was sat quietly, and towards the end he said, well, maybe there's something brand new here.
It was obviously an incredibly exciting time scientifically. It was a time where we were doing experiments that there were very, very few places in the world where you could do. And they ultimately became the basis for what we do today with both the high-flux isotope reactor and the spallation neutron source, drawing on those same basic properties of the neutron that were identified at the height of World War II as being unique and important. In the very last paragraph of Woolen's memo, this is basically what he states, that with higher intensity neutron sources, really exciting new things will become viable. So that started with this X-ray diffractometer that Woolen probably, in the dark of night spirited out of the University of Chicago.
I love this way of doing things because I've done them myself, Find junk, make it do something different. Of course, they had to innovate a lot, which is part of the fun. At those days, the way of recording data was to write numbers in a notebook. Yes, as a counter going click, 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 and every whatever length of time you would write down how many counts you got and move to the next setting and click, 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 click. So the methods were very crude.
In the late 40s, an important breakthrough was the automation of the taking of the data, because this allowed them to take data overnight. This was absolutely state-of-the-art in instrumentation and controls, which was actually an area that the lab was very strong in, because you couldn't go out and buy this stuff. We had to have the capability to conceive it, to design it, and build it. And we were fortunate that we had very ingenious physicists and electrical engineers and mechanical engineers and so forth who could work together and do that. Both Schull and Woolen, had a clear sense of what they wanted to be able to measure, and then just set about figuring out, how do I make this work?
So NOMAD is the world's highest flux total scattering instrument. There's lots of problems in energy science, in environmental science, and biology, where because we have fantastic instruments and we have this very powerful source, we can push the frontier of characterization to solve.
When students talk to me and ask, well, where should I go or what should I do, it's what you're interested in and what can give you that driving enthusiasm that you need to succeed. Dedication certainly comes high on the list, and interest and love of the field, the discipline.
I had a fantastic mentor, somebody who absolutely fostered that sense of excitement and discovery, and I was just hooked. I really like being in a position where I can utilize and advance the tools that we have here, but I can also share them with the world, and I can train new generations of scientists to think about doing the same things and to break their own barriers and to really advance the whole community.
There were various efforts to try and understand both how the lab would interact with the universities and what its role in education would be, and make those assets available to the broader community to explore this new nuclear science that had been developed. We may find new mechanisms in the future, but it's part of the way that our capabilities, like our high-flux isotope reactor and spallation neutron source, our supercomputers, can be part of the research component of an educational experience.
If you think about the contributions that Schull and Woolen made to grand science when they applied neutron diffraction to characterizing materials, there was back in the late 40s, there was this immense sense of discovery, and to continue that sense, to cherish it and to look forward and to capture that approach to science and embody that in the Schull Woolen Center looking forward, I think is really at the heart and soul of what we're trying to do with this enterprise.
It's about developing new world leaders, the next generation of scientists that are going to make the field and really provide them with the kind of education that they can get here with the University of Tennessee and with Oak Ridge together to learn about these cutting-edge techniques, to understand what can be done with new high-performance computing, neutrons, new synthesis methods and so on. And where Scholl-Wallin Center fits in is really central to that, because it's the place we can kind of bring together the scientists and the technologies to hit these challenges where only neutrons are going to be able to address.
Hard to look into their minds, isn't it? Can I look into their minds? Sure, they must have thought this goes somewhere. But how far? And it actually has been very far. This business of neutron beam studies of materials has grown from, say, a few curious scientists to a community that's probably numbered now in the tens of thousands of workers in installations at many places around the world. Cliff Scholl and Ernest Wallin were pioneers who did what they did because they were curious. What can we find out about these materials? How can we find out about these materials? What do these neutrons allow us to find out? That's where they were working.
That kind of relationship between the performance of the sources and the science that becomes possible is still with us today. So as we went to the SNS, for example, a whole new set of experiments became possible. And we're kind of looking at the same possibility as we contemplate the second target station with a very, very intense short pulse, long wavelength neutron source. New science will be enabled.
That entire journey, that entirety of history was required to allow me to sit in this chair and talk to you about what I'm doing. And it gives me a lot of motivation for doing the hard things day to day and thinking towards the future.